Hello and welcome to yet another podcast Pontifications with me, Evo Terra. This, by the way, is not a podcast. This is me using a live video to talk about podcasting. But I do podcasting. Today's topic is what Jerry Seinfeld can teach podcasters about podcasting. Now, specifically, I'm talking about Jerry Seinfeld's most recent show, at least the one that I'm most familiar with, called Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee. Now, if you haven't seen the show, it's really good. It's great. I mean, it's exactly what it says it is, which is not the lesson I want podcasters to take. But I'm watching some over the weekend because they're really good. They're great just to put on and binge watch in the background. They're great. And it strikes me that this is maybe the perfect format for interview shows. And if perfect is not the right word, it's certainly the format I would really enjoy listening to if I was forced to listen to an interview. Most podcasts, I think most is still accurate, still do the interview thing. And while many of them take a long form approach to content where the entire interview is recorded and they might trim off the front and the back. And in fact, this is what I do for my clients. Most of my clients also do interview shows, and it's the standard 5-part classic podcasting format where the main content is one long-ish interview, whether that's a 10-minute conversation or whether that is a hour-plus long conversation. It's a conversation. Now, the opposite of that, that's still interview style, makes a lot more production work, is the, let's call it the Gladwell method, because Malcolm Gladwell does a good job of this in his revisionist history show, and it's the same one that a lot of investigative journalists will utilize, or other shows that are putting together some longer form journalistic audio piece, where they'll go out and conduct interviews, come back into the studio, slice those interviews up, and you'll get just segments and pieces of all those. So some people don't like that because it's not the full natural conversation, and some don't like it because it's not long enough. And a lot of people on the podcasting side don't like that style because it takes a lot of work, because you have to come back into the studio, get behind the microphone. Well, first you have to write some content for the pieces in between the bits. But it struck me listening to, or watching, Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee with Jerry Seinfeld, that this would make a great podcast format. So here's the, and try this. If you haven't watched it yet, turn it on Netflix and just turn off the screen or close your eyes and watch an episode, which means listen to an episode. You'll get most of the content. Because what they do in this show is they strap a whole bunch of cameras onto this car that Jerry Seinfeld drives. Comedian gets inside, and they drive around, and they go to get coffee somewhere, and the whole time they're recording 5 or 6 different cameras in the car. Who knows what the support crew looks like? I've seen, they have cop cars following them so that they can make sure that people aren't bothering them. They can get all the content, and then they distill it all down to 20 minutes. Okay. But I figure they probably recorded a couple of hours of audio out of that. And it's broken down into 20-minute segments. And the brilliance of it, the brilliance of this model that Malcolm Gladwell doesn't do, is with the exception of the setup at the beginning of the show and the exception of the wrap-up at the end of the show, all of the cuts of the pieces that are inside are either one of the two comedians, their actual audio and video on them, or transitional music. Stingers, bumpers, whatever you want to call them. There's no narrated parts inside of the audio or inside of the show itself. Again, narration happens at the beginning and at the end. But the rest of it is either one of them talking or transition between the funny jokes and the funny bits that go on. And the conversation, that the clips themselves are less than a minute. It's rare. In fact, I don't know that I've seen one. I haven't actually done the fingerprinting and look at it, but I need to do that. I'm pretty sure that they are maybe double-digit seconds, and if so, the first number is a 2. That's my guess. Now, again, that's my educated guess by watching a lot of those and trying to study it, thinking, could we as podcasters use this? And I think we could. Here's all that it takes. So go ahead and have your hour-long recording with your guest. That's fine. But then go back, and what if you just identified the good bits? And I mean the real good bits. If it's a comedian, it's literally a bit. If you're doing a comedy show. If it's a business show, less of a bit. If it's an author-focused show, what is the interesting bits that you can pull out? Just those isolated things. And I don't mean 4 and 5 minutes worth of good content. I mean 15, 20 seconds or less of interesting content. And then you take all of that content, where normally what we would do in the style of the Malcolm style podcast is we would then write narrative bits that go in between and do some voiceover work back in the studio and then splice those together. But maybe we don't have to. Maybe just the bits themselves, with some interesting transition music to kind of set the stage and let the jokes land, or let the really imparted wisdom hold for a few seconds before we go to the next bit, but with some nice audio underneath it to really drive the point home. Maybe that's enough to do for an interview show. Because it's not an interview show, really. Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee isn't an interview show. It's a conversation. It's unscripted. At least if it's scripted, they do a fantastic job. But I'm relatively certain it is unscripted. And I will also assume that 95 or more % of all of the conversation between the two people is left on the cutting room floor. But they get, in that 20 minutes, if that's what the episode runs, it's really good content. And it's not just a long-form, boring, in some people's opinions, mine, interview. It's something else. Now, I'm not suggesting you have to do this, but I love new formats in podcasting. And I love the fact that podcasting as a medium, as an industry, has enough room and flexibility to allow multiple formats to happen. So if you're tired of the long-form interview where the people just drone on and on and on, the guest and or the host, and if you don't want to make one of those shows and you want a podcast, maybe try the Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee approach. Take a listen to a few episodes. Go back to an interview that you might have recorded with someone. Or maybe just have a conversation and just get that conversation down. Then go back and cut out just the good parts. Do you have 15, 20 minutes of audio? What if you add in some transition music? That might help out. Could be an interesting way to try it. And I'm interested to try it. And I'm more interested to see if any of you watching this video would like to try that. It's not typically what I do for my clients. I do produce podcasts. I launch podcasts at podcastlaunch.pro. This is what I do professionally, launching podcasts for people. And I would love to try this format. Most of my clients are on that classic format I mentioned. I've got one that's doing the Malcolm style of podcast, which is a lot of work. But I wonder if this is an in-betweener. The Seinfeld style. The Comedians in Cars. I don't know what I'm going to call it, but it's going to be called something. Hey, if you want to talk about this, get in touch with me, please. Podcastlaunch.pro. evo@podcastlaunch.pro is my email. This video is up on YouTube and Facebook and everywhere. It's everywhere. You can't miss my whole series of these. Thank you very much for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with yet another podcast pontification. Until then, cheers.